they had been given by God, and it had come through Paul. And so they didn't have anything that they didn't receive. And so then he asked, why do you boast? Why are you boasting as if you yourselves did something that was great? Because everything, again, that you have, you received from God. They hadn't done anything to deserve these gifts or these abilities. They hadn't done anything to earn them, and so they didn't have any reason to boast. They should have been giving the glory to God, and I think that's something that just reminds us today that we need to be careful that we don't have a similar attitude. We need to remember that everything we have comes from God and give Him the glory and not try to take it on ourselves. So I think that's an important point for ourselves. Okay. So instead of doing this, instead of giving thanks to God, instead of giving Him praise and thanks for what they had been given, as we just saw, some of the leaders and some of the teachers had developed this attitude of pride and self-satisfaction. Do you have a comment over here? I'm sorry. I didn't.
That's all right. I just wanted to mention in verse 6, before we abandon that.
Yes, sir.
Is the fact that he mentions that he's talked about these things so that they would know not to go beyond what is written.
Yes, sir.
Here he's talking specifically about go beyond what is written about different preachers or different personalities. But I think that's a good biblical principle for everything.
Absolutely.
We have to be bound by what is written in the Word of God and make sure that we have authority for everything we do, either general or specific authority for it, but we have to make sure that we're bound by what's written.
Yep. That's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that out. And I do believe that you're right. In the context, I do think he's talking about this pride and separating into these groups, but it is a definite principle that absolutely applies to anything that we look at in the Word of God and how we apply it. Anything else? Okay. So in verse 8, again, he's going to continue, I think, this kind of thought. We had seen that some of those teachers, they had developed this pride and this self-satisfied attitude. We have to read sort of between the lines and look a little deeper maybe than what's on the surface here, but it appears that some of these teachers there in Corinth thought they had progressed so far themselves because of maybe the spiritual gifts that they had actually surpassed Paul and that they didn't need any more instruction from him or from the other apostles. And so he talks about the fact that they thought they were rich, that they were kings, and so they were very proud of themselves. In fact, I think what we see is that they were still very spiritually immature, and that they were very spiritually weak instead. And he's going to talk about that in just a minute. It reminds me of the church at Laodicea, who thought they were rich, but in fact they were poor. Brother Dick?
These several verses we're about to look at make me think of sarcasm.
Yeah. Well, that was my next statement, is that in verse 8, he is going to go forward, or he's going to use I think it's a large degree of sarcasm. He says he would be glad if what they just thought about themselves, that they were reigning and that they were rich spiritually. He would be very happy if that were true, because if that were true, then surely the apostles, including himself, would be reigning with them, and they would be in that same kind of situation that they were in. And if that were true, they wouldn't be suffering the way they were. And to explain that, in the next verse, he's going to go on and he's going to talk about how much they were suffering to preach the gospel. He says, in contrast to the Corinthians' estimate of themselves, they were treated quite differently. And so the first thing he talks about seems to be a metaphor of a victorious Roman general. And when a Roman general had a great victory, he would lead a parade into the city of Rome, and at the end of the parade would be the captives that he had captured during his victory. And those captives would be exhibited to the crowds as they came in. And then at the end, what would happen to them is that they would be thrown to the wild animals in the arena, or they would be forced to fight as gladiators. And so they would meet their end, basically, is what he was saying. And so he says the apostles were a lot like that. We know that they all suffered great persecution. Obviously, Paul did. They were exhibited before crowds. We certainly know that some of them were put to death, and if tradition is true, then we know that all of them except John were probably put to death. And so because of that, he makes this ironic contrast in verse 10. He says, you see us basically as fools, but you see yourself as wise. You say we are weak, but you are strong. You say we are despised by men, while you are honored by men. And so if that were not enough, he goes on in verse 11 and says, the apostles didn't have sufficient clothing or food. He says they were beaten and they were persecuted. Again, we have plenty of examples of that in Paul's life. He says they had no permanent home. They were constantly traveling, weren't they? They were constantly traveling to different places to preach the gospel. So they didn't have any place they really called home that they could settle down in. And they worked to earn their own living while they were preaching the gospel. So, and we know Paul did that even while he was at Corinth. And so they had a very difficult life, which is an apparent contrast to the way the Corinthians were seeing their lives. But in return for this treatment, he says that the apostles blessed those who cursed them. They were patient with those who slandered them. They were considered scum or garbage. They were the rejects, basically, considered to be the rejects of society. So the apostles had a very difficult and very different life than what the Corinthians had. And so they were actually following the example of Christ, if you will, in the way that they put up with persecution, the way they endured persecution, gave us an example of how we should do that. And so I think Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to see the same thing, that is the attitude of humility that they had and the attitude that we as Christians should have. Okay, so let me pause there again and see what Mr. Jim has to say.
So this is a very intriguing passage. I think of in America, there's a term that's often used called the Christian bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Echo chamber, maybe something related to that.
Yeah.
And so this is not a rhetorical question. I'm very curious to your answer. Is this a situation where Paul was, encouraging them to understand that the Christian life is one of suffering? It's not one of popularity. It's not one of riches. It's one of, he talks about the honor of suffering, the blessing of suffering, the same way that Jesus did. And of course, we know Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be rough stuff. I'm not quoting him there, but we all understand all those scriptures that talk about that. So I'm intrigued that this is a situation where he's saying, looks like you've got it all together here. Look at all the praise you're getting. Christianity is an easy life in your community.
I think that's
Or
it.
am I taking it too far?
No, I think that's at least part of it, because I think, we're going to go on to see how they were treating sin, and so if they were living the way they should, I don't think it was going to be quite as easy. Now, maybe they wouldn't be suffering quite like the apostles, but I don't think it was going to be quite this luxurious a kind of a life, because they were going to be living differently than everybody around them if they were living the way they were supposed to. Yes, Easy.
Well, I was also thinking of the state of our country and what's going on, and that this is a very, I don't know, sobering passage. And I have often thought, if we train up our kids to really understand the persecution that may come, and I think that, as I look to where our world is and how much it's changed in the last few years, I just think that that's a hard, it used to be that Christians might be honored for doing honorable things, but I think as the worldview changes, I mean, even in churches that are accepting homosexuality, we are now, bigots and haters, and, good is being called evil and evil is being called good. But this is more of what we can expect. I think in the past we could expect, well, we're doing the honorable thing and people will see that it's honorable, but I think as things change, we're not going to be viewed as honorable. That it is going to be more like what, we're seeing, here in Corinthians.
Yeah, I agree with you. Unless things change, we're definitely headed in that direction. Brother Dabney?
I always like what I see in verse 10 here, where Paul says, in the New American Standard, we're fools for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
Contrasting the type of life, the direction of life that he's talking to the Corinthians about.
Yeah.
And that reminds me that when the Master walked this earth, he said at one point, wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. And that should make us stop and think, what road am I directing my life down? Does it go down a road that ultimately exudes wisdom, or is it foolishness, the road that I'm going down? And that's the decision point that he puts in front of them here. Pick what road you're going to be going down. One of them leads to wisdom, the other does not.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier at, the world's wisdom versus God's wisdom. And if we're going to take God's wisdom, we're going to look foolish in the eyes of the world. But in fact,
Sometimes it takes a little bit to bear out.
yeah, may not see it immediately, right? But eventually. And that may be where we are right now. Anything else? Okay. We already did that. Okay. So in verse 14 down through 21, he's going to appeal to them as his spiritual father. He says, despite all he had endured, his purpose in doing all this and saying all this was not to cause them shame, but to warn them and to correct them. And he did that because they were his children. It actually shows how much that he loves them by the way he was doing it. And he reminds them that he was qualified to do this because he was their spiritual father. He was the one who had initially taught them the gospel. So it didn't matter how many people came in after and taught them. He was the one who had initially taught them. And so he had the right and he had the duty, I think, to correct them as his father. Remember, when he first came there, he had been there 18 months. He had been there a year and a half. And so I think he knew a lot of these people pretty well. And so he had a very close relationship with a lot of them. And so since he was their spiritual father, he basically says that they should be like children. They should imitate him as their father. And so he says in verse 17 that he's going to send Timothy to them to remind them of all this. He's going to remind them of what Paul taught while he was there. He's going to remind them that not only what Paul taught, but how he acted, and that his teaching and that his actions were the same. And he's going to, I think, try to get them ready, if you will, for Paul's visit, because he's going to go on and say he's coming, he's going to come soon, and I think what he's trying to do is get them to make the corrections they need to, so that the trip that he makes won't have to be as painful as it could be. So in verse 18 he says that when he does come, that those people who are questioning him, those people who are causing problems, are going to have to give an answer for their actions and their words. So apparently there were some of these people in this group who had, he says, had become proud, and who were saying that Paul was afraid of them, that in fact he was only sending Timothy to them because he was afraid of them and he didn't want to come, and so to correct them in person. And so in verse 19, Paul says, if God allowed him to, he would come soon. And we know, of course, he did. And then everyone was going to see if these people who were so bold when he was away could back up their big words. Or, you know, we might say where they all talk. They didn't take any action. And so when he arrives, he says he's going to show them that the kingdom is not advanced by eloquent speech, but it is advanced by the power of the gospel. And so basically, they're the ones that have to decide. They have to decide whether, when he comes, whether he's going to have to be harsh with them, and whether he's going to have to punish them, or whether he's going to be able to come to them with gentleness and with love, and so and encouragement. And so in the second letter, Paul talks about the fact that he'd actually delayed his return to them in order to give them some time to make these corrections. And it appears from what we see in that letter that they had made most of those corrections. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 4. Anybody have anything that you would like to comment on at this point in time? Yes, ma'am. I can't.
Going through this chapter all at once, I don't think I've heard the tone and kind of the deeper meaning of this message before. And Mr. Gagnon said with the sarcasm, I think it's really interesting to maybe kind of think from the Corinthians perspective. It's not like they have completely given up on God, given up on Christ. It sounds, kind of in verse 8 again, you already have everything you want, you've already become rich. It's almost like you don't have use for me anymore.
Yeah.
You've gotten what you need from the gospel. And it makes me think of this idea of wanting salvation through Christ, but not sanctification, where it feels really good to accept what makes me right and that feeling of security, but not wanting the true gospel, which is becoming more like Christ,
Yeah.
because you understand the depth of what he's done for you. And I think, again, just talking about our culture today and the things that we can fall prey to, I think that's a big temptation of saying, I already got the message that I want to get from preachers and people trying to help me understand God and his love for me, but I think I'm good with step 1, where I get the good stuff, and then I feel good and fluffy and I become rich, and then kind of leaving the second half behind where I actually have to make changes because God has called me to living more like him. I think that's difficult in our day and age.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think I do think that's throughout the whole letter. Basically, he's saying, you think you're so good, but you're still weak. You're still doing things in your life that you shouldn't be doing, and so while you may have obeyed the gospel, you haven't really made the changes that you need to change. You still have a lot of work to do, and I think that we can do that too. Exactly. I think we can say, well, I go to church every Sunday, and I sit in my pew and everything. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? So, Yes, sir. Sure. Right. Yeah. I think they were just self-satisfied. They just gotten to the point where they thought, I've done everything I need to do, and I'm good, and so I don't need to do anything else. Like I say, I don't need to become more like Christ. I've got everything, and I'm in a saved condition, and I can just go along with the status quo. Trish has something I think she wants to say. Yeah. Yeah. We're going to see who really has the power, right? We're going to see if your talk is really, you can back your talk up, or if I'm going to have to show you who's the boss. Jim?
One more quick comment that Christian spurred in my mind. In this culture, the Greek culture in the first century, the sophists, the Greek sophists, Greeks were so excited about new things.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there would be people that would go around. We know many of their names we study in school. Aristotle and guys like that. And they would go around and they would make big money giving eloquent speeches about something new or some way of thinking. So this was the culture that these people grew up in.
Yep.
So they would have known of that. So that, to me, then, verse 20 really jumps off the page to me. It says, "For the kingdom of God does not consist in talk, but in power." So
Yeah.
I can see that culture being very enamored with that kind of thing. And frankly, Higley mentioned, and I'm not going to name other names, I think we live in a culture where we're very enamored, very impressed with people that are great speakers and have something new to say, right?
Yeah.
And so that may be one of the dangers he's talking about here. That you're so impressed with people that think they've already got it figured out. They're already saved. So now they're going to spend their time telling you how wonderful that is, without really thinking about, okay, let me humble myself and continue to grow.
Yeah.
Like Paul and Apollos and Timothy and those examples were. So anyway, thank you for letting me.
No, I think those are good points. I think back to the very beginning, we talked about the Greek philosophy and how impressed they were with that, and eloquent speakers. So I think that's a very good point. Okay, we're going to move on to chapter 5. Okay, so in chapter 5, he's going to talk about the second major problem that existed in the congregation, and that is the sexual immorality that existed within the church there in verses 1 and 2, we see that there was a member of this congregation who was living with his father's wife. And apparently he was still worshiping with the congregation there like everything was okay. The congregation didn't care, he didn't care. And further, this was well known. This was well known to everyone in the congregation, and it was well known, apparently, to those outside of the congregation. Now, most commentators think that this man had married his stepmother, and that perhaps his father had died, and that so his stepmother and he were fairly close to the same age. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't really think it matters. What we see is that obviously in the environment that the church there in Corinth found itself in, sexual immorality was going to be a continuing problem for this congregation. And he goes on and says, you know, this situation, even in this environment, this situation is so offensive that not even the immoral Gentiles of the city condone it. They find it to be shameful. And in fact, it was illegal under Roman law, and the Greeks considered it to be incest, and so it was repugnant to them. And then, of course, the Jews should have known better, because the law of Moses specifically prohibited this kind of relationship. And so both the Jews and the Gentiles in the congregation should have opposed this relationship. So instead of that, what we see is that they hadn't exercised any kind of discipline at all. And so in verse 2, he says, they had become arrogant and puffed up. I don't know if you can sort of sense the frustration that Paul has with these people, I think, at this point. How many times has he said they're arrogant and they're puffed up, or they're proud of themselves? And so I think he's very frustrated with them. It almost seems like he's asking them, how can you continue to be so arrogant and proud of yourselves in a spiritual sense when you're allowing this flagrant sin to exist within your group? So I think there's a degree of amazement in his comment here, that he's just amazed that they're allowing this to happen if they claim to be Christian. So the reason why would they allow this to happen? Well, some people think that they had a misconception about God's grace, and that perhaps God was going to forgive them for this sin without them ever having to stop. And he had to address that idea in the letter to Romans, that sin was actually producing more of God's grace. So he had to address that in Romans. So maybe that's the idea that they had here. Dick?
Trying to understand how this could be, and I think it's healthy for us to recognize that such a thing might happen in the world of any of us under certain circumstances. I doubt this was a fella who just showed up 2 months ago and all of a sudden fell into this relationship and essentially said to the people around him, this is in your face, this is how I'm going to be, and you ought to accept it. That probably is not how this happened. This likely, I'm guessing, was somebody that they'd known for 20 years among their congregation, who had been accepted and been good in a number of different ways, and his circumstances of life led him to a situation where he got this relationship that he took on that he should not have taken on, and found words to explain it to people around him. So it's sort of, they found a way to swallow it and be okay with it week by week for a little while, and then it just sort of became part of their culture.
And that can happen around us. We can find ourselves in a situation we have to say into the mirror, ought not to be. How did it get this way? And what are we going to do with it?
Yeah, I think you said two things. There's two of the weapons that Satan uses is gradually tempt us to fall away. It doesn't. A lot of times it doesn't happen right overnight. So gradually things happen. And the other thing is to rationalize what we do. And so I think people do that a lot. And so I think those are good things. Yeah, I mean, if we find ourselves in that situation, we can rationalize things that we never would have thought about before that we would have. So I think that's a good point. Curtis?
I think the one of the reasons for this is because discipline is just hard.
Yeah.
It is hard to cut yourself off from a brother who has, in effect, cut himself off from you by the fact that he severed his relationship with God. And it is easier, and I think you see this in most congregations, it's easier just to let something slide than to really take a stand on it, because there are feelings that get hurt. There are relationships that are in there that very often when you discipline somebody, you wind up losing other people because of that. That doesn't mean you ought not to do it. It just means it's always hard. And that may be one of the reasons they've kind of let this slide better than they ought to. The problem with Corinth is they're carnal.
Yeah.
And this is a situation in which the Apostle Paul is pointing out a particularly egregious problem to see how they'll respond to it. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 2, it points out that he did this to see if they would be obedient in all things, because they're so carnal. If they won't take a stand on this, they're probably spiritually gone. But if they will, then this shows that there's life in the congregation. And I think that's an important thing to understand about this whole situation in chapter 5.
Good point. Aaron?
We're called to walk a difficult path between two extremes. On the one hand, we have this kind of tolerance that goes on, and the internet's a terrible place where you can read about things that happen very much like this in churches across the country, where someone has a problem of this nature, and maybe not this exact situation, but instead of casting the person out, they circle the wagons, they protect that person, and vilify the accuser instead of taking care of the problem. But on the other hand, like Curtis was saying over in 2 Corinthians, we see Paul's point to all of this is to produce godly sorrow. And so at the same time, we're called to walk the same path as our master did when he told the woman, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more." And that's a difficulty that we also have, is that once we have in our minds cast somebody out, we also have to be open to taking them back in and letting the past be the past.
Yeah, and he's going to talk about that in this next section. I think all that y'all have talked about, he's going to go on and talk about. So let's look at it just briefly. He's talked about what they weren't doing. Now he's going to talk about what they should have done. Whatever their reasoning for not taking this action, he says, first of all, that the congregation should have been grieving. They should have been sorrowful about this situation. It didn't make any sense for them to be proud of this situation. So the word that is used here for sorrow is like the sorrow you have at the death of a loved one. So this is a serious, deep sorrow, and so they should have had that same kind of sorrow for someone who had died spiritually. And then that grief, as you just said, should cause them to take action to save that person's soul. Secondly, he says that they should put him out of the church, again, which means to be literally taken away. And we'll discuss that probably more next week. But he says in verses 3 and 5 that while he is not there physically, he's already made the judgment on this particular situation. You know, the facts of this case were not in dispute. It had been widely reported. And so, Paul knew everything that was going on. There was no argument about what was happening. And so, while it's clear that he was very concerned about this particular brother, I think what we see is that he's more concerned about the congregation and how this ongoing sin that existed in the congregation is going to affect them and is going to what's going to happen with the congregation if they don't remove that sin. So he's going to go on and talk about how to do that discipline and why to do that discipline. But we're going to stop right there because I think I'm getting the sign that we're about out of time. Thank you.